Welcome to In the Arena, the podcast where politics and policy come alive. I'm your host, Mindy McAlinden, and we are diving deep into the issues, the power plays, and the strategies that shape our world. So whether you're a political junkie or just curious about how things work behind the scenes, this is the place to be. So get ready to jump into the arena. Joining me today in the arena is Representative David Ray. Representative Ray is serving his third term in the Arkansas House. He represents portions of Pulaski and Faulkner counties in central Arkansas. David is also a consultant and communications strategist. He first served as Chief of Staff to Lieutenant Governor Tim Griffin and also worked in Senator Tom Cotton's office as a communications director. In the 95th Assembly, Representative Ray serves as Vice Chair of the Revenue and Tax Committee. He also serves on the State Agencies Committee. So David, join me in the arena.
Glad to be here, Mindy. Several people have suggested that I start my own podcast, but I decided against that because I thought that I would certainly say something that would get me unelected. So I'm hoping to avoid that here on your show today.
Well, now you've made me a little nervous about what I say. Well, anyways, I appreciate you being here today. You have been in the legislature for just 5 years, and you have made a really significant impact on the state. And so I am quite impressed. But what I'd like to do is maybe start at the beginning, if you don't mind, and then we'll jump into some policy. Sound good?
Sure. Absolutely.
Okay, so first let's start with the basics. How did you get into politics?
That's sort of a long story, Mindy, but I'll try to condense it. So I got involved. I got interested in politics at a really early age. My dad was always had strong opinions about politics, and so whether we were watching the news or listening to talk radio, driving home from school in the afternoons, those sorts of conversations would come up. But 9/11 happened when I was a freshman in high school, I believe. And that really sparked an interest in politics for me because it was in the news all the time, right? Our decision about foreign engagements, about things like the Patriot Act and how we combat terrorism, all those sorts of things got me interested in politics. And when I went off to college, I became the college Republican chair at our university. And then when I finished college, decided that I really felt strongly about these policy issues and the direction that our country would go politically. So I started working on political campaigns. I worked on political campaigns in Louisiana, Mississippi, Georgia, Virginia, Kansas, Kentucky, and New York before I came back to Arkansas and got married and settled down here and decided to call this state home.
That's fantastic. So you never actually ran for office in high school or college, just for the college Republican chair, is that right?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I ran. Well,
Okay.
I ran for the House in 2020. That was the first time I sought public office.
Yeah.
But
Okay.
assuming you're not counting my bid for high school class vice president.
Well, I didn't know. That's what I was asking. Okay, so I was just curious because you worked on so many campaigns, but had never really then run a campaign other than for college Republican chair.
No, that's right. I mean,
Yeah.
I had
Yeah.
I spent the better part of 15 years working to help elect people that share my values and beliefs and help in their efforts, and I still do a lot of that. But the more from I would say from 2015 through 2019, I spent 4 or 5 years working really closely with folks in the legislature and around the legislature. And I sort of grew increasingly frustrated with some of the things that I saw taking place and decided, for lack of a better way to describe it, I couldn't do any worse than some of the things I was seeing. So I
Yeah.
think in 2019, that was really the straw that broke the camel's back for me. I think our supermajority legislature passed 5 or 6 different tax increases in one legislative session, and I thought, I think we need some different voices here, and so that was really probably the main thing that motivated me to run.
I love that. Was your family surprised when you made that decision, or were they like, "Yeah, we've been expecting this from you," or
Well, I surprised myself because, like I said, I had been
okay.
content to help other people. Um,
Yeah.
some of my family and friends said that it was not surprising to them that I decided to do it, but it was not what I set out to do. And, I saw a need. I thought that uh, I could add a voice to the mix that would offer a different perspective. And so that's why I chose to throw my hat in the ring.
Well, I love it. And you were just been such a strong advocate fiscally. I mean, I think that's really where you focused your energies, at least as long as I've known you, has been to really for fiscal reform for the state, to take the tax burden off the state, to take regulations off of citizens. Is that an accurate description of kind of where you focus your energies?
Yeah, that's fair. Look, I view myself as sort of a full spectrum conservative. I have conservative beliefs about all sorts of issues, whether it's pro-life, Second Amendment, sort of cultural issues, all it runs the gamut. But there's a lot of a lot of voices that we have in the legislature that are active on some of those issues that I mentioned. So I feel
Hmm.
like the area where I can sort of bring the most benefit to the discussion is on things like tax policy, fiscal policy, regulatory reform, things that don't always make the headlines or get the most clicks on social media, but they matter
Hmm.
for our state government and they matter for the taxpayer and they matter for our budget. So it's all very important.
It is important. So let's talk about a couple bills that you've been running this session. You ran the Property Tax Relief Trust Fund bill. I find this one so fascinating, and it is one of those not sexy, but really important that we hold government accountable. And I think this bill does that. So tell us a little bit about this bill.
Yeah. So in Arkansas, property taxes are almost exclusively a local tax, right? And the state doesn't have much say over that matter. However, back in 1999, we passed an amendment to the Constitution that created the homestead tax credit. And so, um, homeowners for since 1999 have been getting a homestead tax credit. For most of the years that we've had it, it's been in the $300 to $375 range. We've recently increased it up to $500. And that money comes from a pot of money called the Property Tax Relief Trust Fund. The problem is that anytime there's a big bucket of money sitting around, politicians will inevitably want to dip into that pot and spend that money for whatever their own pet projects are. And we've seen that happen multiple times throughout Arkansas's recent history, where politicians went in and took millions upon millions of dollars out for all sorts of things, everything from, you know, economic development incentives to money for voting machines and so on and so forth. And so I just subscribe to the crazy idea that the Property Tax Relief Trust Fund ought to be for property tax relief, right?
Yeah,
So
fair.
um, what my bill did, and you were very kind to support it in committee and on the floor, is it would just say, hey, if we're using these funds for anything other than property tax relief, which is what they were intended for, it's got to be subject to a really, really high vote threshold. So 3/4, 75% is the vote threshold that we put into law, and that should hopefully protect that fund for the future.
Yeah, I think that was a really wise bill. I was surprised last year to hear in one of our meetings that that money had been dipped into a couple of times for things that weren't property tax relief. I kept waiting for you to use the term at lockbox, right, to make sure that we were putting the property tax into a lockbox. But anyways, I think it's great, and I actually like that you left the possibility to use this in dire need. If 75% of the legislature agreed that we needed to use this temporarily, that we could, and I think that was a nice way to handle that. So I did like that bill. Okay, let's talk about the remote and mobile work bill. I don't think you've presented this one yet, um,
I
but
haven't presented this one
okay. So reading your bill, it looks like about 40% of people either work from home or work part-time from home. So it's a pretty significant number of people, but your bill implied that Arkansas had really tough regulations, like at the bottom of the barrel regulations when it came to making it easy for people to work remotely. So let's talk a little bit about this bill and tell me when you think you might be presenting this.
Yeah, well, I've got a special order scheduled for March 11th, so that's when it'll
Oh, that's my
be.
birthday.
But this is a complicated issue that I will to keep your viewers from falling asleep. I will try to distill it down as compactly as I can. So our economy is and our workforce are more mobile today than they've ever been before. People travel for work all the time, whether they're going to a work conference in a different state, whether they're traveling to visit clients, whether they're electrical line technicians from Arkansas that are traveling to Louisiana for a few days to help with storm recovery, or vice versa. People travel all the time for work, but Arkansas's tax code has not really caught up with the times. if you look at the National Taxpayers Union, which is a pro-taxpayer group that ranks the states 1 through 50 in terms of how friendly their tax code is to accepting of remote workers, we rank 45th out of 50. Well, that's not good, and we could do a lot better. Arkansas's tax code is so draconian in this regard that if you earn a single dollar of income in the state of Arkansas in a given year, you are required by law to file an income tax return with the state, even though, you may not have any tax liability at all. And on the employer side, you're also required to begin withholding immediately if your worker spends even a single day in the state. So it's really sort of punitive to business. There's a big regulatory and compliance burden that comes with that. And a lot of times what happens is people come to the state, they work here for 3 days or 4 days or a week, and then they end up having to file an income tax return because of that. They have no tax liability because they were only here for a small amount of time. And then at the end of the year, they have to file a tax return, pay an accountant to file a tax return just so they can get the withholdings back refunded to them. So to me, this is
So
a
what is
win-win-win. It's good for the taxpayer. It's good for the taxpayer. It's good for the businesses. It reduces their compliance burden. And I think it benefits the state too, because it's less administrative burden that they have to process and fewer refunds that they have to dish out when most of these people have almost effectively no tax liability.
Yeah, I think that's great. And again, I know a lot of these are hard to kind of explain or distill down, but they really do impact people in their pocketbooks. I mean, these are real, when we talk about, these laws don't impact me or what do I care? These are laws that literally impact you every day. If you are a working person, if you're traveling when you work, these are really important bills. And so that's why I wanted you to kind of dive in and explain
Well,
it.
and to your point, it does matter to people. I've received letters of support from the Arkansas State Chamber, which obviously represents a lot of businesses. The NFIB, that's the National Federation of Independent Businesses. They're the nation's largest voice for small businesses across America. I've received letters of support from Americans for Prosperity, who's a pro-taxpayer group, the Tax Foundation, which is a pro-taxpayer group, National Taxpayers Union, which is a pro-taxpayer group. So all the people that have dug in and understand what's going on here that are pro-taxpayer, they support this effort. And I've had somebody run the numbers. That ranking that I told you we were 45th in, if we were to pass my bill, we would be 17th.
That is wonderful. It's a pretty amazing jump with just a small change. And taking the burden not just off of taxpayers, but also off of businesses. It's rare that you get that win-win on both sides of the job aisle. So I love that. Let me ask you about your Inflation Reduction Act. So you ran that, I think, in 23, right? The initial act was run in 23, and then you amended it. You're amending it this session. Is that correct?
Well, I just reintroduced it. I didn't change anything about it. I just
Okay.
reintroduced the same bill.
Okay.
The reason I'm
Okay. And
offering
you were,
this,
go ahead. Yeah.
well, there was a bill in Congress that was also called the Inflation Reduction Act that really
It's a little
didn't
different.
do anything but make inflation worse, right?
Yes.
So that's why I sort of ironically chose the same name, because my bill is actually aimed at helping people cope with the really devastating effects of inflation. So it's no secret that Americans are facing a crisis of affordability. Your grocery bill that used to be $120 is now $170. Whether it's gas, groceries, housing prices. Housing has just become so unaffordable through a combination of general inflation, insurance costs, property taxes, all sorts of things. And so I'm trying to help people cope with this crisis of affordability. One thing that our tax code does that is good is we adjust our brackets each year to account for the effects of inflation. That is good. However, our state will only do a maximum adjustment of 3%. That is set out in the law. And so all my bill does is it removes that 3% cap so that we have a true adjustment that accounts for the cost of inflation. Because, and I know this is a little bit technical, but bear with me. In 2020, in 2022, and 2023, we had really bad inflation. We had inflation that was 6% and 8%. If you get a year of 6% inflation and you only adjust the tax brackets by 3%, guess what happens to the other 3%? You, the taxpayer, has to eat it. and you get what is
Mm-hmm.
effectively an unlegislated tax increase. So it's just another piece of pro-taxpayer legislation. You know, in most years when inflation doesn't exceed 3%, it's not going to have any fiscal impact at all. But when you get those really bad years of inflation like we had during COVID, it would help the taxpayer quite a bit.
Yeah, it is. And it is a big deal. And again, it's one of those that it's hard to put that on a bumper sticker, but it is an impactful change for every taxpayer. And didn't you also increase the standard deduction for 2026? Did I see that in your bill as well?
That was a different bill, but yeah, I filed a bill
Okay.
to double our state standard deduction. You know, of all the states that have a standard deduction, we have the third lowest in the country. And as you know, the Trump tax cuts, which were very beneficial to economic growth, they doubled the standard deduction at the federal level. So I was
Hmm.
just trying to accomplish the same thing for us here at the state level. And that would be a benefit to a really broad based benefit to um, almost a million taxpayers in our state. But it would also simplify our taxes, right? The more people that
Yeah,
just take the standard deduction because it's higher, that means fewer people have to keep up with all these itemizations
exactly.
and track their receipts when it comes time to file
Yeah.
their taxes and that sort of thing.
Yeah, that's the worst for sure. I can never find the one receipt that I need for sure. And we have a governor, right, and Governor Sanders, who has been very pro reducing the tax burden on Arkansans. So it's been a great time to kind of get some of these bills and to clean up our tax code. Hopefully, at some point, we will move to a zero income tax.
Absolutely, that's the long term
Yeah.
goal. And Governor Sanders has shown great leadership. We've cut um, under her leadership. We have, along with the legislature, we have cut income taxes 3 times in the last 18 months, I believe it is. And we now have a top rate of 3.9%. That's the lowest income tax rate we've had in the history of our state. If you go
What was
back
it when you
to
started 5 years
um,
ago? Sorry, I didn't mean to
when
interrupt you,
I
but what was it when you started?
started,
Yeah.
I think it was 5.5 when I started.
Yeah.
When I first
That's
got
amazing.
elected, now we're at 3.9. If you go back 11 years ago, which is really not that long ago, if you go back
Yeah.
11 years ago, we were at 7%. So we've
That's pretty
basically
drastic.
we've basically cut the income tax in half in 11 years.
Yeah.
I don't think a lot of people realize that. So
Yeah, it is
we just
great.
got to keep our foot to the we got to keep our foot to the pedal. Keep going.
I agree. I agree. It's been great. I've been blessed to kind of be under these last 3 years of being able to see a lot of these tax cuts come in. So it's been fun. Can we switch and talk a little bit about some of your constitutional amendments? You filed a couple of constitutional amendments. Is that
Yeah,
right?
I
And
did.
it
Yes.
looks okay. So let's talk about them. The first one was talked about ballot initiatives and I think shifting the burden of proof to the person who has been deemed insufficient in their petition. Is that right?
So the first one, I think the one you're referring to just repeals what's commonly known as the cure period. So for statewide initiatives, when folks gather signatures to try and get an issue on the ballot, they have to turn those into the Secretary of State's office at a designated time. And the way our system works now is as long as you get, I think the threshold is 75% of the amount you're supposed to get, you get an additional 30 days to go and collect more signatures.
Yeah.
Um, I sort of liken that to an assignment in college where your paper's due on a Friday and you turn it in and the teacher says, you got 70% of the paper done. I'll let you have another 2 weeks to work on the project. I don't think that's really how our initiative system is supposed to work. You either get the signatures or you don't. Um, and I think it's a perverse incentive because it allows it incentivizes sponsor groups who are gathering the petitions to get as many signatures as possible so they can reach that threshold,
Hmm.
regardless of whether those signatures are valid or not. And so, what we're finding is that the Secretary of State's office routinely finds somewhere between 20 to 30, sometimes even 40% of these signatures are not valid, but they're turning them in so that they can qualify for that additional time. So, My amendment would just get rid of that extra time period.
And I love that. And it also allows groups to come in during that extra 30-day time period, outside groups to flow money into the state to try and get those signatures as well as to, I don't know if that's recording or not.
Yeah,
And so I think
absolutely.
that also is a reverse incentive. So I'm glad that you're doing that. It's almost like telling your kids, if you do that one more time, I'm going to punish you, and then never punishing them. So I think that's great. And it does take the burden off of Secretary of State. I think we've also seen several bills come through this session that kind of support what you're doing in terms of tightening up this ballot initiative process, just to make sure that we are sincere, the people who are trying to get those ballot initiatives on the ballot, that they're sincere, but also that we're not overburdening the Secretary of State's office, because I also think that's kind of a strategy too. If we get enough at the Secretary of State's office, they have difficulty meeting their deadlines. Is that fair to say?
Oh, absolutely. So the two bills
Okay.
that I've passed so far this session on the initiative process, one of them was House Bill 1221, which really just is not a real big substantive change, because this is the way the process has operated for 80 years, between 80 and 100 years, is when you get that ballot title approved and you go out and collect those signatures. My new law stipulates that those are only valid during the election cycle in which they're gathered. Right?
Mm-hmm.
You couldn't get signatures now and just keep collecting signatures for 5, 6, 7 years and put it on the 2030 ballot. You couldn't do that under
Right.
my new law, and that makes a lot of sense because, you know, as I mentioned on your previous question, the percentage of signatures that are turned in that are invalid is already astronomically high. It's a serious problem when 3 out of every 10 signatures somebody turns in are not even valid signatures. If you carry over
Mm-hmm.
from one election cycle to the other, that problem is going to get exponentially worse, because
Yeah.
people move from one county to another, they move from one state to another, people become deceased over time, they commit felonies and are therefore ineligible to sign. There's all sorts of reasons why we do that. The other
Yeah,
the
that
other
is
bill that
great.
I passed,
Okay.
1222, on this
Mm.
issue deals with the ballot title review process. So currently, the Attorney General, for 80 years, the Attorney General's reviewed ballot titles, but the AG can only reject a ballot title if it's found to be misleading, which I'm glad we have that in place, because it saved us from a lot of misleading ballot titles.
Yeah.
And the public does not benefit from that. The voters certainly do not benefit from that. But the protections that we have are really not strong or robust enough to protect us from a lot of the really problematic ballot titles that we could see. Last session, you had a ballot title that attempted to regulate private schools in a way that um, many could argue would infringe on their constitutional right to, teach religious instruction. And so, what I'm doing with 1222, and this bill has gone to the governor's desk for her signature, is it allows the attorney general to reject a ballot title if it's in conflict with the U.S. Constitution or with federal statute. And the reason we do that is pretty simple. Nobody benefits from having to weigh in on a matter that is in conflict with the Constitution. It's the supreme law of the land. We can't pass anything contrary to it and expect it to be upheld. So it's best to just reject those titles on the front end, and so that we don't have to deal with those really problematic issues.
Oh, it's great. And you are actually saving the taxpayers money, because we are not now having to take issues to court and try and defend those or defeat those in some way in the court system. And I think it also prevents voters who may or may not understand the complexity of the issues, because it's so in the weeds. It prevents them from feeling like maybe we're doing something underhanded, right, by something being overturned. That it's just very fair up front that if it violates the Constitution, we shouldn't be voting on it in the first place. So
That's
I
right.
think that's a great bill. Let's move on real quick
And
to your
the
other
people who
one. Oh,
disagree with that, I sort of would just want to ask them, like, which part of the Constitution are you okay violating? Like,
yeah,
is it First
exactly.
Amendment, freedom of speech,
Yeah.
freedom of religion? Is it Second Amendment? Maybe it's Eighth Amendment. Maybe they want cruel and unusual punishment. I don't know.
Who knows? But that's a great question. So the other one that I saw that you had run or you're planning to run is the citizens only voting. So let's talk about this one. I think this is a fantastic. It's terrible that we have to say it because I think that it's implied in the U.S. Constitution that you need to be a citizen to vote, but it kind of is where we are because we're seeing places like New York where they're letting non-citizens vote in their local elections. And so tell me about this amendment.
Mindy, this is one of those issues that I never thought we would ever have to deal with. It's sort of like men and women's sports. Like when I was growing up, if you had told me that that would be an issue that I would one day have to vote on, I would have told you you're insane. That's crazy. But yet in 2025, here we are. You're right. We have places out in California that are letting non citizens vote in our election. And call me crazy, but I subscribe to the pretty simple notion that Americans should decide the future of America. And so, what this proposed constitutional amendment would do is it would just change the language in our state constitution regarding who's eligible to vote from every citizen to only citizens. And that's important because every citizen puts in place a floor. But as we've seen in other states, you can add to that
Hmm.
floor. You can say every citizen shall be able to vote, plus these other groups of people. And only citizens is much clearer, it's much stronger, and it would prevent non citizens from
Yeah,
voting.
I really appreciate you taking time to run this.
Amazing that we
It
have to
is
do something
amazing,
like
but
that.
I'm glad that you're being a good watchdog and
And I would add Missouri just
go ahead.
no, thank you. I would just add that Missouri just amended their state constitution to ensure that we have only citizen voting in Missouri. It passed with almost 70% support. So I feel confident that if we could refer this out to the voters of Arkansas, it would pass with
I
overwhelming support.
absolutely agree with you. It's a good ad for sure. Well, before we go, I just want to make sure that I've covered everything you want to cover. Are there any other bills coming up? And if not, I'm going to ask you this question instead. Do you have a favorite bill of something that has become law that you are most proud of? So either one, either or both.
Oh, great question. Okay. Well, the bill that I do get asked sometimes, like, what bill are you most proud of? My freshman term, I ran a bill that we did not get passed. It was sort of colloquially referred to as special election reform. I came back in my second term and we did get it passed. This was an issue we've been working on
Oh,
for
wow.
10 years and we'd failed every single time. We finally got it done in 2023. I'll summarize it this way. Most people are familiar with this phenomenon. Local governments, not all, there's a lot of good people serving in local government. I don't want to be misconstrued. But unfortunately, a lot of times local governments would take tax increase issues, property taxes, sales taxes, etc., and they would put them on the ballot for voters to vote on because they had to have voter approval, but they would hide the election.
Mm.
They would put it on some random Tuesday in February or some random Tuesday in July when nobody would go to the polls. You'd get 5 or 6% turnout. And of course, it would pass and the taxes would go up because the only people who turned out to vote were the ones that were in the know. So my bill just made it so that these types of elections had to be held in conjunction with the normal election dates that we see each year. You can't play hide the ball with the tax increase or anything like that. And for years and years and years, a lot of the lobbyist groups at the Capitol fought us, and they beat us back a lot of times. But this was something. This is probably the thing I'm most proud of getting done in the 5 years
That's
that I've been
great.
in the legislature.
Man, I appreciate your diligence on that because I know you fought pretty hard to get that through. So I appreciate that for sure. Well, David, thank you so much for being here. And yeah,
And I'm confident. I'm confident it's already saved hundreds of
oh, I
millions
have
of
no
dollars
doubt
for
because once you
taxpayers.
shine a light on those things, they tend to go away. So what do they say? Sunshine is the best disinfectant, right? So yeah, excellent.
There you go.
Thank you so much for being here, David. I really do appreciate your time, and I look forward to serving with you.
Thanks, Mindy. You too.
Wow, it is such a pleasure. It's actually a real pleasure for me to work with Representative David Ray. He is truly committed to improving the lives of Arkansans through tax reform and regulatory reform, and he has done an amazing job in the very short 5 years, which is really just, we're in 2.5 sessions for him. He's still pretty new on the scene in Arkansas politics, and yet he has made an amazing impact. We went over a couple of things that he did today. He's currently running a bill to make sure that Arkansas is spending its money the way it's supposed to be by running the property tax relief fund bill, basically making sure that any money that is collected for property taxes is indeed spent on property taxes and not rated for other purposes. And as simple as that seems, it's important that we do that and make sure that money is being used wisely. In addition, he also continues to push for reductions in taxes and fairer tax codes. And we talked a little bit about him doubling the deduction as well as adjusting the tax brackets and making sure that Arkansans are feeling the relief that they need during high inflationary periods. And then we talked a little bit about some of the constitutional amendments. The way that it works in Arkansas is the legislature will refer out 3 amendments to the ballot, and those will be on the ballot in 2026. And so we'll see which ones come out. I think there were over 40 filed this year that are in the running to become one of those 3. And so we'll keep an eye on those. But I do hope that citizens only voting is one of the ones that comes out. I think that's a real simple bill, but it is one that I think is really important for every state, but especially for Arkansas. So again, I am so grateful that David Wade is here working for Arkansas, and I appreciate what he does, and I am so pleased to be able to vote in favor of the bills that he runs. Thanks again for joining us today. I hope to see you next week in the arena.